In most anatomy books, when they talk about what the deltoid does, a lot of them break it up into anterior, middle, and posterior deltoid, and that kind of stuff. And they might even say, your anterior deltoid is a shoulder flexor, and your middle deltoid is a shoulder abductor, and your posterior delt is a extensor, or something like that. But we want to look at from a little bit greater mechanics of what these different fibers in this muscle can do. Because, the deltoid is a fan-shaped muscle, right? It's got this wide, broad attachment at the top here, right? Going across the whole underside of the spine of the scapula here, all the way around the acromion process, all the way into the lateral half of the clavicle, which I see sometimes in the cadaver lab. So you'll see it wrap around pretty far around here. So it makes this almost like a nice C-shape attachment around the top here. And if you look at, mechanically, look at the longitudinal axis of the shoulder joint, of the glenohumeral joint, which is internal external rotation in this position. That longitudinal axis, these fibers here on the anterior delt, when they contract, what they would do is they're pulling in this direction, so they would actually spin this into internal rotation, right? These posterior fibers would actually spin it into external rotation. And again, depending on how far to the middle delt you go, like the anterior fibers of the middle delt will probably still be helping with internal rotation. The posterior fibers of the middle delt will be helping the posterior delt with external rotation, right? If you guys can see that. One of the other things that we don't look at with respect to the deltoid is when you're in different positions. So if I start to come up into shoulder abduction, what you'll notice, if I'm going to move into horizontal add and abduction, we kind of know this. I mean, you'll say if you look at the axis, it goes down through this way, and this humerus is moving anteriorly or posteriorly around this axis. The anterior fibers, because they're in front of that, when they shorten, they're going to pull him into horizontal adduction. And then these posterior fibers, because they're behind this axis, they're going to pull him back into horizontal abduction and then back behind his body this way. If I were to add rotation to that, so let's say we add an external rotation to that. So let's turn Brian a little bit this way on the seat. So when he adds that external rotation, this attachment rolls down under this way. So these anterior fibers of his delt are going to be more looking at more abduction. So when you look in this position, because he's externally rotated here, these anterior fibers are above this axis of AB adduction. So the anterior fibers are going to help him with abduction, and the posterior fibers would help him pull this down. If there was something pulling up on his hand this way, these posterior fibers are below this axis, so they would help pull his arm down this way. Now conversely, if he were to internally rotate and go all the way into full internal rotation this way, and let's spin all the way around this way, Brian. So now we move the attachment further this way. So now the posterior fibers of the delt are above this axis. So the posterior fibers are now abductors. So they're gonna help pull him up this way. And the anterior fibers, because they're below this axis of rotation, his anterior fibers of the deltoid are going to be adductors. Things that we really need to look into a little bit deeper into muscle mechanics and joint mechanics, which we don't typically do look into it in as much depth as we should to really understand how the body moves. Plenty of times throughout the day where we get ourselves into these positions, and most practitioners aren't exploring in-depth muscle mechanics to understand which division of which muscle is helping with that. So if you have a weakness in that position, to be able to understand what fibers help with that, and then training those fibers in different shoulder positions may help to change the land-tension relationship. So when you train it, it's gonna affect the muscle differently. When we're looking at training muscles, we really need to understand the mechanics, the joint mechanics really well. We need to understand the muscle mechanics really well, because even if a muscle could do something, if the joint doesn't allow it, the muscle's not going to overpower the limitation of the joint to yank it in that direction, right? Really understanding joint mechanics, muscle mechanics is key to understanding human function.